There's a chance that COVID-19 was created in a lab, and then it leaked out and infected the world.
The Chinese city where the coronavirus pandemic is believed to have started.
They're very competent, trustworthy scientists.
Probably it was incompetent, somebody was stupid.
Whoa, did I just say that? Yes, I did. 6 months ago, I would not have been able to say that, but today I can. And we need to talk about it. Humans, including myself, hate uncertainty, ambiguity. We want to know what happened. But in the case of COVID-19, we still don't know exactly what happened. We don't know where it came from. And to try to get at the real answer, you have to navigate all sorts of politics. But wait, isn't this a science question? Isn't this a matter of epidemiology, the origin of a virus? It should be, but woven into this scientific question are a bunch of heavy political questions and considerations that are influencing what kind of questions we're allowed to ask and what kind of answers we're allowed to give. So I want to strip away the politics, the tension with China, the idea that this all sounds like one big conspiracy, and I want to just look at the evidence of one question, which is, where did COVID-19 come from?
The most trafficked wild animal in the world.
Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory.
China has a history of lab accidents.
Are you suggesting that maybe you have some evidence that this was not a naturally occurring virus?
So it's not just me who wants to know the answer to this. Last month, President Biden asked the US intelligence community to double down in answering this one question: where did COVID come from?
It's important to know the answer to that.
Right now, there are two major hypotheses. One is the spillover hypothesis, and the second one is the lab leak hypothesis, which has up until recently been seen as a fringe conspiracy theory.
Complete baloney.
And I'm going to explain why that changed in just a minute. But first, let's look at each of these. First, the spillover hypothesis.
Health officials believe COVID-19 originated in animals sold in a so-called wet market in China.
A pangolin kissed a turtle.
The spillover hypothesis says that the coronavirus came from bats in China, which is pretty predictable. Bats in China have tons of coronaviruses all the time. They're usually not infectious to humans. But the hypothesis says that a strain came about that was infectious to maybe an animal, maybe one of these guys, a pangolin. And then that animal showed up in some supply chain, some market in central China, and it came in contact with a human, and the human got COVID-19. And in fact, for a while, it was this particular market in Wuhan that was seen as the culprit. They thought the bat virus was in an animal somewhere in this market. And now listen, for a really long time, up until just recently, I didn't know this was a hypothesis. I thought this was a fact. Like in the early days of the pandemic, they would talk about this like it wasn't a question. They'd be like, and the virus that came from this meat market.
The virus originated from a market.
This meat market, ground zero for the outbreak.
But guess what? There's no direct evidence for this. They don't even have pangolins in the Wuhan wet market. And soon we learned that the first official COVID case had no contact with this market. So the Chinese CDC had to come out and say, okay, no, it actually has nothing to do with this market. We have no idea where this outbreak came from. But even after they said that the market wasn't the epicenter, the idea was still that this came from a bat that transferred it to an animal, that transferred it to a human, the spillover hypothesis. The main reason why this hypothesis gained so much traction was because this is how pandemics usually happen. Of the past 5 pandemics, 4 of them were the result of a virus jumping from an animal onto humans. So even though no one had found an animal with COVID-19 to prove this theory, they sort of presumed that it had to be because look at these other 4. But wait, what about this one? The Russian flu of 1977 was likely the result of a lab accident, and it ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people. But even still, the spillover hypothesis was kind of gospel. Hey, real quick, I'm gonna be doing a Q&A on Discord next week, a week from today, on Thursday. It's gonna be a live stage event, which is sort of like a personal chat with whoever wants to join. Discord, by the way, is the sponsor of today's video. Thank you, Discord. But anyway, this event is where you can join and ask me whatever questions you want, and I will be talking for an hour about storytelling and about my process and about the future of documentary things and Bright Trip and all of the things. I will be answering all of your questions in this sort of personal back and forth Discord live stage setting. Anyone can join, it's free. All you have to do is sign up for Discord, which is like a 15-second process. Sign up for Discord. There's a link in my description where you can register for this Q&A event, which is next week, Thursday at noon Eastern time, okay? So I'm going to put on the screen what time that is in other time zones around the world. Noon Eastern time on Thursday. I will be answering tons of questions on Discord as a live stage event. And I'm kind of excited to hear from all of you, to hear what questions you have, and to chat and catch up and see what people are thinking about. So thank you, Discord, for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. But quietly, there was another theory that was brewing under the surface, one that many experts didn't talk about publicly at the time, but they thought about. They were thinking of another building in Wuhan, not this market, but another building that was just a few miles down the road. This one right here, the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So here's what's crazy. It's exactly in this specific lab in Wuhan where scientists have been experimenting for years with coronaviruses, engineering them to make them even more infectious to human beings.
More infectious to humans? Whoa. By the way, that's Paji. He's one of my producers. He reached out to me a while back and said that we should look into the alternative hypotheses of where COVID came from, including this idea that it may have leaked from this lab. At the time, I was quite skeptical. I had heard rumblings about the idea of a lab accident that caused COVID, and I'd sort of written it off because it just seemed so conspiracy, just like low-hanging fruit conspiracy, like super engineered virus escapes from lab and starts global pandemic. It's like New World Order. It just reeks of like internet conspiracy and disinformation. And in addition to that, the only people who were touting this were like people who are not very good at the truth, and people who also liked to pick fights with China.
I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
But I told Paji that if there's any evidence, even circumstantial, that warrants looking further into this hypothesis, I would be interested in checking it out. And it turns out there was such evidence, and here it goes. So, this is the lab leak hypothesis, and I'm going to unpack it the best I can. First, let's talk about this lab. It's located in central China, the city of Wuhan, and for years, they have been experimenting on coronaviruses, what Paji was telling me about. The question is, why on earth would you want to make a coronavirus more infectious to humans?
So this is what's known as gain-of-function research, and the idea is to study more infectious versions of the virus in order to learn from that what we need in order to stop the next pandemic from ever happening in the first place.
Gain-of-function research. This is sort of like testing nuclear weapons. You're sort of playing with fire, testing something that has the power to kill millions of people, but you're doing so in the name of like helping humanity. There are only 3 places on Earth that do this sort of risky research, and it's supposed to be done in these super high security, biosecure facilities that have all these parameters to make sure that the engineered virus doesn't escape. And by the way, in the scientific community, many people think this is too risky and not worth it. One critique I read from a scientific journal said that, quote, if the virus escapes, nobody could predict the trajectory. We're messing with genetics, and that's scary. Okay, but just remember for a second that all of this gain-of-function research is happening in like 2015 through 2018. Just rewind for a second. None of us had heard the word coronavirus before. This was effectively some boring, wonky, nerdy debate happening between super niche scientists who were studying the best way to look at viruses. And all the while, as they did this work studying all of these coronaviruses from bats, the freezers in this lab in Wuhan started filling up with more and more samples of coronaviruses of all kinds. Some just captured from bats in caves, and others engineered to be more infectious to humans. But again, no one really cared. If I had made a video about this work in 2017, you wouldn't have watched it. But in 2017, there was someone who did care. It was someone at the US Embassy in Beijing. They caught wind that in this Wuhan lab, they were curating coronaviruses and engineering more infectious ones. This wasn't some secret. This was like in collaboration with scientists in the US and around the world. But even still, they sent a team of health experts to check out the lab. And what they saw troubled them. The lab wasn't nearly as safe as it needed to be. And the managers at the lab said that they were lobbying for more resources so that they could hire properly trained technicians to safely run the lab. The diplomats were concerned and they sent 2 messages back to Washington, D.C. at 2 different periods of time. They said this lab isn't safe and the State Department should work with the Chinese to tighten security. These 2 cables went back to Washington, D.C. and both were ignored. Again, this was like super boring stuff in 2017 and 2018. No one had heard of Anthony Fauci. This wasn't top priority. So it was ignored until 2020, when suddenly we all care about virology.
Concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S. 2, 3, all the way.
Okay, so you have this lab that's doing gain-of-function research. They're maybe not very secure. Now it's 2020, and I need to explain something that was hard for me to understand at first, but it's very important. Any hypothesis as to the origins of COVID has to take into account the fact that this new deadly coronavirus called COVID-19 broke out in the very city where the largest repository of coronavirus samples sit in a freezer in this lab, some of which have been engineered to become more infectious to humans. Oh, and the lab has been deemed not super safe. If the outbreak had happened in some other city where there was no lab with a freezer full of coronaviruses, we would not be having this conversation. This would not even be on the table. But Wuhan is the epicenter of coronavirus samples on Earth because of this lab.
Oh my God! There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Like, oh, I don't know, maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean. Or it's the chocolate factory.
Okay, wait, hold on. I know some of you were thinking this. I was thinking this. At first, I thought this was a logical fallacy. Originally, I had said, well, of course, it's not a coincidence that there's a coronavirus lab in the same city that there was an outbreak. The lab was probably set up because there's a lot of risk of coronaviruses, so they set up the lab to study it so that they could prevent it. But then I read an interview with one of the top researchers at the Wuhan lab, one of the biggest experts in bats and coronaviruses, and this changed my mind. Her name is Shi Zhengli, but her nickname is the Batwoman.
You're about to become compost.
Because she's made her career out of going into caves, getting coronavirus samples from bats so that she can study them. She's like a top expert on this stuff, and she works in the Wuhan lab. When she heard that there was a coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, she was in Shanghai at a conference. So she got on a train to rush back to Wuhan. So she's on this train, and later she said in an interview, quote, I wondered if the local health authorities got it wrong by calling it the coronavirus. She's like, something's off here. Wuhan is in central China, and from the Batwoman's extensive study into this, she knows that it's actually southern China where all the bats are and where coronavirus is most likely to jump from animals to humans. Way down here in southern China, that's where COVID-19's cousin SARS broke out in the early 2000s. That's the place where there is an actual major risk of coronavirus jumping from animals. So the Batwoman is on this train, shaking her head. She literally said in the interview, quote, I had never expected this kind of thing to happen in Wuhan, in central China. This is a thing that happens in southern China, not central China. And then the terrifying thought hit her. She said, quote, could they have come from our lab? Her first thought was, the health officials got this wrong. It's either not coronavirus, or if it is, it probably came from our lab. That's the more likely scenario, not that it jumped from animals like it does in southern China. So no, the lab isn't set up in Wuhan because Wuhan is the epicenter of coronaviruses jumping from animals. Instead, Wuhan's relationship to coronaviruses isn't that it's common that it breaks out in wet markets. No, it's because of the lab. The lab is the world's largest sample of coronaviruses on Earth. Now, let's be clear, this isn't hard proof that anything happened. This is circumstantial, but it is absolutely a firm foundation for a hypothesis that potentially this could have come from a lab. That woman herself, that was her first thought. And as I've been reading accounts from other virologists and epidemiologists around the world who heard of a virus coming out of Wuhan, they thought about the lab. They're like, oh shit, there's a giant lab there with tons of viruses. I wonder if it came from there. Now listen, this lady who we're calling Batwoman, the bat expert, went to the lab. As soon as she got to Wuhan, she was sort of freaking out. She had been losing sleep, and she looked at all of the data, all of the samples, and determined that none of the samples, engineered or natural, were the same as COVID-19. None of them were an exact match. And she sighed a breath of relief, and she felt like, okay, it wasn't our lab. For most scientists, that was enough proof to put the lab leak hypothesis to rest. They're like, oh yeah, Batwoman said that none of the samples were identical to COVID-19. But for many others, trusting this one woman to tell us the truth or to have done a thorough investigation is not good enough evidence for us to rule this out. The world, who has suffered greatly because of COVID-19, deserves a chance to truly investigate, not trust one Chinese researcher.
The world has reached another grim milestone in the history of the coronavirus pandemic.
This is globally. The death toll has now topped a staggering 3 million people.
But for some reason, China is not really playing ball with letting an inquiry or an investigation happen. When Australia got up and called for a transparent investigation into COVID's origins, including looking into the lab leak hypothesis, China immediately retaliated with economic sanctions on Australian products like wine and beef. What? Little defensive? Like, wouldn't China want to have an independent investigation into this hypothesis so that if it's false, it can be proven false and we can put it to rest? It seems like that would be in their interest, and yet they're making it incredibly difficult for anyone to do an investigation. Instead, we have to rely on US spies and intel to piece this together. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that there was intel that said that 3 researchers at the Wuhan lab got sick with COVID-like symptoms, and they had to be hospitalized in November 2019, weeks before the first official case of COVID. Again, this isn't proof, but it's definitely reason to ask more questions. China, stop making us rely on intel from spies. Put the hypothesis to bed and let us investigate. But they won't, which is incredibly suspicious.
Mike, at the end of the day, it's profoundly in China's interest to do this as well, because look, it suffered too.
Okay, so that's the lab leak hypothesis. Unsafe lab that's the coronavirus epicenter, and it engineers viruses to be more infectious for humans, has a little mishap, which turns into a global pandemic. It's a feasible hypothesis that deserves investigation. Now listen, if your brain is anything like my brain, what both of our brains are doing right now is scheming to find some sort of certainty. We're like, ooh, look at all this evidence here. They were in the hospital and Wuhan is actually the epicenter. And we're like piecing it all together. Our brains love to do this, to lay out the circumstances and fill in the blanks so that we can believe in some sort of certain thing. Our brains hate ambiguity, but please don't be tricked by your hate for ambiguity. We have to remember that neither the spillover hypothesis nor the lab leak hypothesis have solid direct evidence that prove them one way or the other. The main evidence for the spillover hypothesis right now is the idea that historically, this is how viruses like to start. They jump from animals onto humans. That's a really solid basis for a hypothesis. We should absolutely continue to investigate that. But guess what? It's been 1.5 years, and we haven't found an animal who carries COVID after 1.5 years. So as of now, it is still in the category of hypothesis. But if you read the news in 2020, it seemed like the case was closed. Like it was a settled thing. Like, yeah, the coronavirus jumped from an animal.
The pangolin.
Pangolins.
Probably one of these pangolins in a market. Everyone move on. Meanwhile, the lab leak hypothesis also had solid basis. None of the evidence I've talked about today is new. It's all been around. And yet, until recently, the idea of a lab accident being the origins of COVID-19 was deemed as far off fringe conspiracy.
This question about the Wuhan lab, we know that it's been debunked that this virus was man-made or modified.
A major reason for that was because there was the Trump administration that was constantly overstating the hypothesis, claiming they had way more evidence than they actually did, labeling it the China virus.
The Chinese virus.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
Which helped fuel a spike in discrimination and violence against people of East Asian descent. And then Tom Cotton gets up and says this.
The virus went into that food market before it came out of that food market. So we don't know where it originated, but we do know that we have to get to the bottom of that. We also know that just a few miles away from that food market is China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that researches human infectious diseases.
Well, this is awkward. Yeah. It turns out what Tom Cotton said actually is totally sensible. I had written this into the script thinking that Tom Cotton said some crazy stuff about something.
What 5G actually does, it absorbs oxygen, and that's really important to know.
But it turns out that Tom Cotton back in like February of 2020 was stating a hypothesis that a bunch of scientists now think is totally legit. So nothing's changed. We don't have any new evidence. And yet at the time it was written off as a total fringe conspiracy. Here's the New York Times. Senator Tom Cotton repeats fringe theory on coronavirus origins. It was completely downplayed, written off, and put aside as a fringe conspiracy. This was a failure of journalism and journalism's job of looking into hypotheses and actually validating them based on the available evidence. As Tom Cotton says, there actually wasn't any direct evidence, and there still isn't. And yet today, nothing has changed, but scientists look at the hypothesis and see it as totally legit and worthy of investigating. And I almost just got caught in the pitfall, trying to do journalism and about to regurgitate what I read on the Washington Post and New York Times, that Tom Cotton said some crazy stuff when he actually didn't. That is dangerous, when reporters just repeat what others are saying and jump on the bandwagon because it's correct to do that. What's correct is to go report and look into the evidence, which is something a lot of journalists didn't do during this time. And so scientists, even if they believed that we should investigate it, and the media downplayed it, wouldn't touch it. Until recently.
The coronavirus may have leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China.
U.S. President Joe Biden launched an investigation in late May.
Why would you have a bad coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan and not in southern China where these horseshoe bats are located?
Trump left office and things settled down with China a little bit. And lo and behold, we're now seeing legitimate, well-respected experts on this topic come out publicly and declare that the lab leak hypothesis isn't a conspiracy, and that both hypotheses need to be taken seriously until we have sufficient data. It's called science, by the way. It's just called science. Just look into legitimate hypotheses. But what was troubling to me is that even still, there are scientists who are digging in their heels, saying that the case is closed.
There is zero evidence that this virus came out of a lab in China.
Like this guy, for example. He's a leading expert in animal diseases and disease ecology, and he's been the leader of calling the lab leak hypothesis a fringe conspiracy theory, like since the beginning, when we knew nothing. But here's the thing. This guy has skin in the game. His NGO gets loads of funding to perform research at, wait for it, the Wuhan lab.
Members of the scientific community have said that Daszak has a conflict of interest due to his close ties to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its leading scientist, Shijung Li.
So of course he doesn't want the Wuhan lab or gain of function research to be smeared. Like, this is his home turf, where his livelihood and his life's work comes from. And he's the guy we're listening to? Like, we're letting this guy lead out on the inquiry about where the origins of COVID come from? Oh, and it gets worse. So the WHO, World Health Organization, sent a group to investigate the origins of COVID a few months ago. And this guy helped lead the team. I mean, he's like a world expert. But guess what? The results of what he came back with were not surprising.
A team of international experts investigating the origins of COVID-19 have all but dismissed a theory that the virus came from a lab.
Talk to people, ask critical questions, got critical answers, and they've come to their conclusion, and I have as well. And what they say is extremely unlikely.
But then eventually a journalist calls him out.
Given that this report rules out a lab leak, isn't your credibility on that a little undermined by the fact that you've been saying that even before you came here?
No.
Yes, you can't go into an investigation with your mind already made up, dude. Especially when millions of dollars of funding for your organization is on the line. That's not science. That's self-interest and tribalism. Listen, I don't doubt that Daszak is an earnest believer in his theory. I mean, he's a zoologist by trade. Of course he thinks it jumped from animals. But this shouldn't be the guy doing the investigation. Oh, and it's not just me who thinks that this investigation was BS. The head of the WHO, literally the head, the guy who commissioned this study, said that the investigation into the lab leak theory, quote, wasn't extensive enough. It was too hasty. So yeah, they didn't actually look into it. These scientists are not actually looking earnestly for empirical evidence. Okay, that was a lot. There's a lot to soak in here, and I want to give you a few big takeaways that are like the thing we should take away from this video. Number one is that we don't know. I know we all hate to hear this, but we don't know. The evidence I've laid out here for both the lab leak hypothesis as well as the spillover hypothesis is all circumstantial, meaning it's you have to connect a lot of dots to make it work. And science isn't about connecting dots, it's about proving something with solid evidence. We don't have solid proof of anything. So please, please, please don't give in to the temptation to now believe that COVID came from a lab. It may have come from a lab, but it may have jumped from animals after being infected from bats. We do not know. We should investigate both. Number two, it is mind-blowing to me that a hypothesis can be labeled as fringe and conspiracy all because of politics. And then it can just immediately get reversed depending on the political climate. The media so hardcore downplayed the hypothesis of the lab leak. And they did so because Trump was in office and he was using an overstated version of that to stoke hate and tension and lies. So I kind of get it, but we sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater. Number three, it is very disappointing to me that scientists whose motives should be nothing but seeking the truth, keeping everything on the table that has any promise, they are digging in their heels, throwing a legitimate hypothesis off the table and lobbying to keep it out of the public, and showing that they are probably influenced by the fact that their funding and life's work is associated with the other hypothesis that they don't like. I get it when politicians do that, but leading experts who we're all looking to for truth and guidance, come on guys. We need to stay open to any hypothesis that has a reasonable basis to stand on. And we need to do that so we can find out how this thing started and ensure that it never happens again.
A final note, more than a year ago, top scientists published a letter in the prestigious medical journal Lancet that dismissed the lab leak theory. They called it a conspiracy theory. So ABC News reached out to all 27 scientists who signed that letter. About a dozen responded, several of them telling us they're not so sure this thing came from nature. And one scientist telling us he's flipped entirely, and he believes that now the lab leak theory is more likely.